My name is Oliver Ronnie Bastienne. I am a Seychellois, and I am currently the chairman of the Seychelles Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the main private sector organization here in Seychelles. But also, I mean, but that's not my full-time job. I do that on a voluntary basis. My main job is I am a partner in a professional service firm. Of course, the pandemic has infiltrated, if that's the right word, within all our economies, all our jurisdiction, and causing really kind of a heavy impact on the global economic activity. And especially for us in Seychelles here, we rely heavily on international tourism. It almost translates into 25 to 30%, between 25 and 30% contribution towards our GDP. But if you really would understand the economy of a tourism destination, almost all the sectors are indirectly linked to the tourism market. And so whilst the contribution of the tourism sector is 25% to 30% of our GDP, of course, with the reduction in activity from let's say 100 to basically zero with regards to tourism traffic, when we close our border down in March, I feel that well, I'm not feel, but you can see the heavy impact that it has had on all businesses and on jobs within the economy. And when you look at the initial projection that we had with the different economists and technicians and even the IMF, we were looking at a 10.8% contraction of our GDP compared to around of a 3.5% pre-COVID level. But that was on the assumption that we will have a V-shaped recovery. But I think that when we look at the current situation, when you look at how the pandemic is I guess translating now with wave two, wave three, the V-shaped recovery is no longer an assumption that economists holds. It's now whether it's a U or an L-shaped recovery, if you could term the recovery from that perspective. And the recent statement by our president, which we at the chamber, we more or less we're more or less aligned, that the recovery of the tourism market will take almost between 3 to 5 years. And so what we are obviously seeing is that there is, of course, an impact on businesses, with a lot of businesses starting to consider closing down, or some has already closed down. And it's very sad because it's impacting the livelihood of the private sector, but also it also impacts the livelihood of workers, because you are in a situation where jobs are being lost. And even though we do have the various schemes and measures and fiscal intervention that is there, like a lot of other countries have made. We are seeing the impact, even though we are not felt the full impact just quite yet. And one of the key impact that we see is because of the lack of tourism revenue coming in. Of course, it creates the demand supply issue with regards to the foreign exchange element. And there we've seen an almost 30% devaluation of our Seychelles rupees against the dollar. So that translating, of course, in your CPI numbers and of course personal disposable income, and the fact that we import majority of our items here in Seychelles. Of course, there's a big impact on the purchasing power of a lot of consumers. So I think in a nutshell, whilst we can go on forever to look at the various impact, I think this is the main impact that we are seeing here in Seychelles. Of course, the main policy surrounds public health. I think that's been very positive for us, and of course the involvement with the social partners is fairly limited there, because it's more of a health crisis, and so that's been fairly limited, but it's been very positive, and the intervention has been very strong and for Seychelles. On the economy front, we're looking at wage support that the government has introduced. We've created a company that basically absorbs what retrenched workers and place them in employment in the private sector. Other fiscal measures around taxation, of course, on the finance element, moratorium, interest holidays. Um, but also we've had policies or schemes that have been formulated to assist the private sector with regards to financing, especially of working capital. But the most fundamental, or one of the most important discussion was around the reopening of our commercial scheduled flights, which happened on the 1st of August. And there really was a multi-sector approach, and all partners within the tripartite umbrella was extensively involved in the decision that was took, which was under the chairmanship of the president, was taken in consensus and in collaboration. But to just point out that we do have weekly meetings with the president as a private sector organizations. Both unions are present. But like any dialogue and any consultation and discussions, you have good days and you have bad days. I think we have to be honest about that. I think there can be much more that we can do, improve on, to have that social dialogue framework. But there is a foundation. It's based on respect, but we do have our moments that we do have a go at each other. Let's put it this way. So from a recovery perspective, I think, like I mentioned earlier, that we are no longer looking at a V-shaped recovery. We're looking at a much more longer term recovery. And there, one of the things that we did as a Chamber of Commerce, we with the collaboration of ILO, the EMBO section under the with Gary Reinhardt and his team, we put together a framework called the Recovery and Prosperity Framework, which consisted of surveys and interviews and so on. But really, this framework looks at seven policy themes or seven intervention area, which really is to look at the challenges and the impact of COVID. And here we're looking at the framework that we've more or less presented to the president, which is based around how do you effectively deal with the structural changes. And here the structural changes is based around digitalization, the future of work, the whole aspect of social dialogue, the aspect of how do you deal with international connectivity now, especially when we see that there is this disruption to global supply chain and globalization. So it's important that as a jurisdiction, you are looking at that area, especially in the recovery process. And so this recovery framework kind of looks at that, not to go into too much detail, but what is important with regards to the eventual recovery, and with the presidential and parliamentary election looming here in Seychelles, which will be in October of this year, it is important that any governments that wins, or even governments in other jurisdictions, that they should be looking much beyond election, the next election, or even the election, another 2, 3 elections, because the critical issue, which we believe at the Chamber of Commerce, is really how do you unite in terms of the society, which I believe is very, very important, that you no longer have stakeholders all fighting for very different elements, but everyone fighting from a national perspective, and everyone is on the same way, same hymn sheet. And of course, we need in terms of intervention and ideas and policy intervention around the new way of healthcare, which I think it's fundamental. And the different organizations like the Chamber of Commerce have got a very pivotal role to play in that. But also we need to look at the economic front. We spoke about that, but also looking at the geopolitical front. And this is why it's important that there is more leadership from local, but also from these geopolitical or these multilateral organizations to really help and assist different jurisdictions and different organizations. And we see the great work that ILO is doing, especially under severe strain that a lot of the EMBOs are going through. And it's fundamental that there is this geopolitical kind of discussions and leadership, global leadership. I think that's fundamental. So I think this is the way a recovery should look like, and from the lessons that we've learned, it's key that there is that proactive social dialogue, because, like I mentioned, you can only do it with a united front and with everyone being together.